Washington's sky doesn't just look gray lately. It looks gray because of arithmetic. Numbers hang above people's heads like weather that can't be prayed away. 36,000 billion, then 37. People hear those figures and they feel something primitive, helplessness, dread, the sense that whatever system is running the world has stopped listening to human scale. And when a system reaches that kind of debt, the truth is simple and brutal. Someone will pay, if not through interest, then through inflation. If not through taxes, then through devaluation. If not through obvious bankruptcy, then through a quieter, cleaner trick, one that sounds like progress. Today I want to pull the curtain on a story the public is being trained to interpret as innovation. Stablecoin, CBDC. Digital money that's supposed to make the future easier, safer, faster. And I'm going to tell you the part most people refuse to say out loud because it feels too cynical. This isn't only about money, it's about ownership of reality. It's about who gets to decide what value means and who gets crushed when the definition changes. If you came here thinking this is a technical video about finance, you'll miss the point. The real subject is psychology. It's about how trust is harvested, how risk is outsourced, and how individuals and entire countries can be maneuvered into becoming participants in their own replacement. Stablecoin and CBDC are not just products, they're instruments for turning dependence into infrastructure. They're a method for making the world complicit, one click at a time. Here's what most viewers won't admit to themselves. You don't just like convenience, you like not having to think. You like not having to face the uglier questions. Who benefits when you're holding something safe? Who pays when you're told to accept uncertainty? And why do you keep believing the pitch when the track record is the same? The same pattern shows up everywhere, from your workplace to your relationships to your investments. A power structure offers you comfort. Then it changes the rules while you're still grateful you were allowed in. So let's start with the obvious surface story, then we'll walk under it like a detective, not a believer. The official narrative says stablecoins are stable because they're backed. They're tied to real assets, like government bonds. Sounds boring. Sounds sensible. No drama, no rocket science required. Except backed is not the same as yours, and stable is not the same as safe. Stability can be engineered for the benefit of the issuer. Stability can be a leash disguised as a bridge. Imagine your country is drowning and a stranger offers you a life jacket with a logo on it. The life jacket floats, at least for now, but the stranger also controls the valve. In your mind, you think you're surviving. In their mind, you're maintaining their ability to keep the boat moving while they steer toward deeper water. Stablecoins are sold like the life jacket. The hidden part is the valve. When you hold a stablecoin that is backed by a reserve of U.S. Treasury bonds, you're not merely holding a neutral token, you're participating in a chain of claims. The reserve exists because somebody believes the issuer's credit is worth something, and that credit does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside politics, inside enforcement, inside global coordination, inside the fact that billions of people and institutions have been trained to treat U.S. debt as the safe parking spot for their money. The psychological mechanism is subtle. People love the feeling of being rational. They say it's backed. They say it tracks dollars. They say it's less volatile. They say it's efficient. Each sentence is a way to avoid the uncomfortable question. If it's so safe, why does the issuer get to define the rules? Why doesn't the buyer get the upside and the downside at the same time? Why is the stability guaranteed by a system that can change its own guarantees? And now we get to the deeper part. For decades, the U.S. has used the world's trust as an economic weapon. In the beginning, the deal looked clean. The dollar is backed by U.S. power and U.S. institutions, and in exchange, the world coordinates around it. Then something changed. In the early 70s, the link between dollars and gold was cut. The narrative wasn't marketed as theft, it was marketed as necessity. The world was told the system had to evolve, and the evolution did what evolution always does in power games. It removed friction for the issuer. It created flexibility that looked like freedom, while locking everyone else into dependency. People don't remember history as a psychological sequence, they remember it as events. But power structures work like habits. When you remove a constraint once, you learn you can remove it again. When you convince the public it was unavoidable, you learn the public will accept the next adjustment as common sense. That's how trust becomes a resource. That's how a currency becomes a protocol. Now consider the debt bomb. When a government owes more than it can comfortably pay, it has limited choices. One choice is austerity, which is politically brutal. Another choice is inflation, which is economically brutal but politically survivable if you can hide it. Another choice is default, which is catastrophic and loud. There is a fourth choice that looks technical, not violent. Redefine the unit, rewrite the accounting, reset the system so the pain moves somewhere else without calling it pain. Stablecoin and CBDC are part of that fourth choice, not in the sense that a coin magically deletes debt. Debt is arithmetic. It exists whether or not you talk about it, but value can be reassigned. Contracts can be reinterpreted. Conversions can be adjusted. The meaning of what counts as a dollar can be changed. And when you're holding a digital asset that is tied to that meaning, you're not protected by the technology. You're protected only by policy, and policy can be revised. This is where the video's title energy should land. The idea is a magic trick, and it's magic because most people can't see the audience manipulation. The trick is not producing value. The trick is moving the perception of who owes what to whom. If you can change the unit of measurement, you can make the same debt feel smaller in real terms. If you can rebase the currency, you can cut the visible weight of obligations without declaring default. Let's make this concrete through a human example, because that's where the pattern becomes obvious. Picture a family business. The father says, "We're still solvent, we're just reorganizing." The bank emails a new interpretation of the contract. The payment schedule is adjusted. The interest is temporary. The father keeps telling everyone to relax, because the paper is still there. But the cost is quietly shifted. The business is still alive, yet the family is trapped in a new structure where the bank has more control and the owners have less. Stablecoin structures can feel like the same thing. Users think they are holding an asset, but depending on the design, they may be holding a claim to a backing that can be revalued, restructured, or used to support the issuer's next step. Even if the coin is always redeemable at par in ideal conditions, you still face the deeper question: par relative to what? And if the system itself is being positioned for a future reset, then stable becomes time-limited comfort. Here's the uncomfortable psychological truth people hide from themselves. When you chase safety, you often accept invisible control. Because control is never free. If someone gives you stability without transferring real ownership, you are not buying safety. You are buying permission. Permission to participate in their system while they keep the authority to alter outcomes. And the real genius, if you want to call it that, is that stablecoins can recruit global users into the issuer's credit ecosystem without demanding that the issuer openly raises debt. It's like turning the public into a funding mechanism. The world believes it is investing in a neutral instrument. The system treats it as liquidity. Liquidity supports policy. Policy supports stability for the issuer. And then, when the issuer needs leverage, the issuer has leverage because the world is already inside. But the next psychological section is the one that hurts. The idea of risk outsourcing. People don't like to think about who is holding the bag. They prefer to think that risk is distributed fairly. They prefer to believe that if something collapses, the market will take the hit equally. That's comforting fiction. In real structures, the party with control usually limits their downside while the party without control carries the uncertainty. Stablecoins have been marketed like that magical middle ground. Less volatile than crypto, more liquid than traditional finance, more real world than pure tokens. The marketing is seductive because it offers people a story they already want to believe, that you can have upside without responsibility, that you can benefit from the system without understanding the governance, that you can get returns without becoming accountable. But if the stablecoin is backed by US treasuries, and if the treasuries are subject to the same macro forces as the dollar, then the user is still exposed to the issuer's credit and the issuer's currency regime. If the issuer decides the exchange rate for the unit changes, or the legal framework for redemption changes, you don't get a board vote. You get a notification. You get a clause you never read. You get a temporary suspension. You get a new rule that says, in effect, trust us because we are the system. This is why the cold genius feeling is not praise. It's a warning. The mechanism is cold because it doesn't rely on violence. It relies on compliance. It relies on people continuing to do what they were trained to do. It relies on institutions continuing to accept the same asset class as safe. It relies on users continuing to believe that digital form equals protection. Now let's go even deeper, because this is where the hidden self becomes personal for many viewers. The hidden self is the part that knows you are tempted by systems you shouldn't trust. You're tempted by shortcuts. You're tempted by narratives that make you feel like you don't have to be brave. You want a stable life, a stable partner, a stable income, stable investments, stable social status. You want stability so badly that you forgive structures that take your agency. Stablecoin and CBDC appeal to that longing. They sell stability as a product. But in power terms, stability is a method. Stability means predictable usage. Stability means you can program flows. Stability means you can set thresholds. Stability means you can attach enforcement to money. And enforcement changes behavior. Think about what happens in countries with heavy financial surveillance. People don't say, "My freedom is gone." They say, "It's inconvenient today." They say, "My account is under review." They say, "I had to wait." They say, "The bank made a mistake." Over time, the mistakes repeat. Over time, the limits become normal. Over time, people self-censor because they fear the cost of being wrong. CBDC is designed for that psychological transformation. Money becomes a channel where permissions can be granted and revoked. A transaction can be flagged. An address can be blocked. A category can be punished. Even if the official story promises rights and transparency, the technical reality is power concentration. Whoever controls the ledger controls the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and that's the real dark twist. Crypto was supposed to weaken centralized control. The mythology was clear. Decentralization equals freedom. But when governments adopt blockchain technology, the promise changes. The network becomes infrastructure for governance, not rebellion. The ledger becomes a dashboard. The freedom becomes a feature set. So ask yourself something uncomfortable. When you hear the word programmable money, do you think liberation or do you think compliance? Because programming always has an author. It always has an intention. It always produces outputs that match the programmer's goals. Now zoom out to the geopolitical chessboard, because macro policy is never only macro. Europe's vulnerability is not only economic, it's psychological. Europe has trained itself to believe it is a rules-based actor, not a dependent actor. When energy shocks hit, when supply chains tighten, when industrial costs rise, the dependence becomes visible. And then stablecoin and CBDC narratives become another dependency layer. If settlement rails are controlled or influenced by one power block, then sovereignty becomes a costume. Europe faces a choice that sounds like freedom, but is actually trap selection. Join the controlled system, or build a parallel system that will still face friction and eventually dependence anyway. Either way, the practical outcome is the same: more constrained policy space, less ability to react independently, more reliance on a global standard that someone else writes. Asia, on the other hand, is positioned differently. Some regions have less emotional attachment to the Western financial story. They don't need to defend an identity. They can pivot toward assets and trade relationships that feel more tangible. Energy, commodities, production capacity, real supply chains. That's why shifts often begin quietly with merchants and industrialists, not with speeches. When trust in one unit wobbles, people move toward assets that feel harder to erase. Here's the parallel that many viewers will recognize instantly because it mirrors their personal life. When you lose trust in someone, you stop negotiating. You stop asking for promises. You start paying attention to what is tangible. Who delivers consistently? Who holds boundaries? Who can't be erased with a policy change? You seek proof in the only place that counts: behavior. On the global level, the tangible is gold, silver, oil, and energy infrastructure. The psychological appeal of these assets is primal. You can't patch a spreadsheet to make an oil barrel disappear. You can't reset a mine with a software update. You can't freeze a physical resource in the same way you can freeze a digital balance. Even if prices fluctuate, the asset's existence is harder to rewrite. That's why, whenever currency faith cracks, precious metals and energy re-enter the conversation like old friends returning during a crisis. Central banks buying gold at scale is not a random investment hobby. It's insurance logic. It's a statement: if the paper story breaks, we need something that survives the rewrite. Now we connect back to stablecoin. Stablecoin is an instrument built from trust in issuer institutions. Gold and energy are instruments built from distrust in the permanence of institutions. Stablecoin says, says, trust this backing. Precious metals say, we assume the backing can be redefined. This is the deeper human lesson. You can't build a secure identity on systems that can be changed unilaterally, and most people do that anyway because it feels normal. Your job can change rules without consent. Your government can change regulations without your input. Your partner can change terms of loyalty. Your platform can change terms of service. Your bank can change accessibility. Your investment can change definition overnight. It's not always a conspiracy. Sometimes it's just structure. Power uses structure. Stablecoin and CBDC are being positioned as the next structure, not necessarily as one sudden event, but as a gradual takeover of financial rails. The quiet part is that once rails are standardized, turning control on and off becomes easy. You don't need armies, you need permissions, you need keys, you need compliance, you need a world that is already integrated. Now let's talk about the magic trick feeling again, because it's the emotional core of why people are unsettled by this topic. The trick is that the issuer can appear to reduce burdens without admitting harm. In a normal bankruptcy, you see the losses, you see the liquidation, you see the pain. In a reset strategy, you see a new definition. The losses are distributed through reduced purchasing power, through conversion rates, through re-indexing, through policy friction. So in your